You guys can have your cameras on if you'd like. Once the speakers start talking, we'll pull them up to the front. And we'll have Q&As throughout, so you're able to kind of hop on with questions. You can put them in the chat, or you can wait for the Q&A. But we hope to keep it pretty organic and engage, and feel free to introduce yourself to each other throughout the chat. And we hope that you can make some connections today. Hey, Brooke, do you want to get started?
Awesome. Yes. Again, thank you all for joining us today and making the time in your busy schedules to be here for MarigoldLive PR and branding in the psychedelic space. I'd like to start off with a land acknowledgement. As we gather in this virtual space, we acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet is historically the home of Indigenous peoples. Marigold is based in the Halton region. Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. We acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for being stewards of this traditional territory. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous people on this land. I'm now going to pass it over to our incredible co-founder and CEO, Katie Pringle, to touch on who Marigold is.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. A big special shout out to our speakers who you'll meet shortly. Marigold has been providing PR and branding and content services for the cannabis space since 2016. And we've been working with clients in the psychedelic space and getting to know the space and learning from many of you since 2019. And there's absolutely so much to learn. And that's something I always acknowledge when I'm speaking to this group, because we are so grateful for your time and your expertise and all the work and research that you're all doing to move this industry forward. If you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn. Or even email the info account. We're happy to move that forward, and we'd love to have a chat about your goals over the next year. But in the meantime, we're here to learn from some amazing speakers. David will be taking us through a presentation, followed by a panel that talks about the state of the industry. Then we'll move into a conversation around PR and branding with Michael and Corey. And so thank you very much. Well, like I mentioned, we'll have questions along the way. Please feel free to interact in the chat. This is for all of us to get to know everyone. And, we welcome questions along the way. And for that, I'll throw over to Brooke, who will get David rolling with his presentation. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. Without further ado, we'll be kicking off with David Harder, founder and CEO of At My Journey Centers and founder and executive director of Catalyst Presents Foundation, with an analysis of the movement and progress within the industry to date. David, if you'd like to introduce yourself and get started.
Yeah, thank you. I've got 10 minutes to go through an overview of what's happening in psychedelics, so it's going to be a bit of a flying jet. We did this at Catalyst, and it was interesting pulling up the numbers and how much has changed even since May. And how many trials are being done. I wanted to start by just saying we just came out 2 days ago of 4 days of intense work with 14 therapists from across Canada in the first clinical trial for therapist training. I believe of its kind, probably in the world. So legally, Health Canada approved, ethics board approved, clinical trial for therapists to actually experience what it's like to try psilocybin. And there'll be lots of information coming out about that, some of the data points, very fascinating. It was a psilocybin / psilocin capsule, and it acted very much like magic mushrooms. That's my biggest takeaway, that I was a doubter. It's like, we got to use the raw mushrooms, and they acted just like I would have done with magic mushrooms. So fascinating work. I'm excited to be in this space, and the therapists, it was so cool to work with them and seeing their vision for where this goes. I'm going to share my screen here really quick and just go through a few slides as an introduction. I work with Catalyst and At My Journey Centers here in Calgary. Catalyst, of course, was in Kingston. I got to know a bunch of people like Corey Firth through that process, and we had a great year together, and that's where we met Marigold, and appreciate the work they did for us there as well. Really quick, where are we at as an industry? What I want to do is just highlight names. This is going to be pretty, a lot of detail. If you want these slides, I'd be happy to share them with you later. This is not exhaustive. This is just kind of a snapshot of what's happening in this business, just to show how big this has become. This is just Canada. universities across Canada that are working with or researching or studying psychedelics. I got to tour the Inveric, I believe is the name of the company at U of C, that's doing some really cool research into alternative molecules. U of A is doing stuff here in Alberta at Lethbridge. There's a lot of work being done all across Canada in universities. This is no longer a fringe science. This has become mainstream in university study. And you can see that across the states, across the world. There's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of research facilities and universities that are studying psychedelics. This I pulled up, and again, these are the numbers that really surprised me. At Catalyst in May, these numbers were almost half of what they are now. Already in the last 5 months, it has exponentially grown in terms of how many trials are being researched and launched in the psychedelic space. Just in psilocybin, 114, LSD, 138, kind of the leader. MDMA, 120, right up there. And ibogaine and mescaline as well, starting to see some research being done. So this is, again, like I said, not fringe science. This is not something on the sidelines. There are hundreds and hundreds of people spending a lot of money to find out what these medicines are for, how they work, what can be done, how we can incorporate them into our mental health. And generally, beyond mental health, there's studies being done on very fascinating applications for these. And if you look at clinicaltrials.gov, you can see the details. You can research or actually search out by different medicines, search out by different areas of the world, and see what's going on with psychedelic research. And this, again, there's names missing on this list, but just treatment centers and clinics around Canada and North America that are working with psychedelics. Educational offerings, people offering training in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. The list just keeps going, and it keeps growing every month. Some that have been around: CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies, MAPS, Compass, or actually MAPS and CIIS are the two that have been around the longest. And then a lot of new folks entering the space, including us at my academy, doing experiential learning through the vehicle of a clinical trial for therapists. And the supply side, huge work being done since this list was put together. Like even Optimi, I noticed they've gotten huge strides adding MDMA to their list of research chemicals that they're supplying and creating in their labs, in addition to psilocybin, and many of the others doing massive growth. Not-for-profits, another piece that's been around for probably the longest in people working with other people in a not-for-profit vehicle, and this list keeps growing as well. And so, end of my quick overview, but we want to get into what's happening with clinical trials. But I think the industry in itself is growing and growing and growing with no end in sight. And at the same time, we're seeing some of the corporate side seeing that maybe these massive billion-dollar plays that are being done is not the right method of bringing this to the markets. That the real model of psychedelic therapy is helping heal trauma, and that doesn't mean prescribing a palliative care drug, which pharmaceutical companies need in order to really make the billions of dollars. So you give somebody a treatment like we did this last weekend. There was transformative work that was done. That mean these guys have arrived? No, but when we see how these things can help solve root trauma-based depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addictions, it's not a model that can just make billions of dollars because these people get treated and they're helped and they're fixed. They're no longer prescribed PTSD or whatever that diagnosis may be. And so it's really beautiful to see how this can be brought forward and how many people and how much dollars is being spent in this. My personal opinion is I don't believe it's a billion-dollar play. I believe it's going to be one-on-one therapists helping people with these medicines that are going to make a difference in this world. That's my opinion. And I'm looking forward to this conversation with the folks that are going to join me here now. So I'll turn it back to you. I think, Katie, you're going to introduce the rest of the folks. Or Brooke, sorry.
I'll jump in. Thank you so much, David, for that presentation. And congratulations again on completing phase 1 of your clinical trial. So our first panel of the day is the State of the Industry panel, moderated by David. Our speakers are Sherry Boodram, co-founder and CEO of CanDelta Inc., and Jaspreet Grewal, co-founder and CEO of Node Group Inc. Speakers, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and we can get started. Sherry, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I could go first. So I'm Sherry Boudram. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Candelta, which is a regulatory and scientific cannabis and psychedelics consulting company. We're based in Toronto, but we have offices in New York and New Jersey, and we largely help with licensing and operation support, but also help with some other things tangential to that, like mergers, acquisitions, and general compliance and auditing work as well. So my background, I'm a chemist by training, so I have a PhD in chemistry, and I worked at Health Canada for a long time, for a number of years, as a senior compliance and enforcement officer in licensing and inspections compliance for the medical cannabis program and also for the controlled substances program as well. So I did that before working in pharma for a bit after that, and then started Candelta. So we've been operating for 4 years now.
Awesome. So I'll go next. My name is Jaspreet Grewal. I'm based in Calgary. So I'm a clinician and moved into finance a couple of years ago. And the company I'm here representing today is called Node Group. And many of you were here to actually see my co-founder and COO, Sabrina Ramkelawan, speak. She sends her regrets as she now has COVID. So I am here in her place today. Node Group started a number of years ago, just over 3 years ago, as Sabrina and I brought together our clinical consulting companies, just because we saw a need for more focused clinical trials, primarily starting in the medical cannabis industry, and we got very busy in psychedelics quite quickly. As a company, we are not a typical CRO. We do a fair amount of management consulting structure as well as access to finance through our corporate finance and equity research desks. As an organization, we understand the needs of companies at what we like to call emerging biotech. So when we look at investigational new novel therapeutics like psychedelics, they're always there to address a novel need, but they're also interesting compounds that do have, and which Sherry will speak about, very nuanced and difficult regulatory hurdles that we do have to also overcome. So what we do is we really try to help companies first make it to Series A, have enough capital to get through a clinical trial, but also understand things like commercialization processes, identification of the right indication, as well as where in the world to run your clinical trial, and then connecting the dots between the right sites and the right PIs. And then we do move into health economics as well as commercialization and market access for some of our clients. And psychedelics is certainly one of our busiest fields. We are a Canadian company, but we also have a base in the United Kingdom, and we're currently running a number of projects and clinical trials in 9 different countries, and are very fortunate to have partnered with some fantastic academic institutions, as well as researchers and nonprofits. So thank you for having me here today.
Well, I think I'll jump in. I introduced myself already, but I'm going to moderate this so I get to ask the questions and then poke holes in the answers. How's that sound? Make it interesting. Appreciate both of you and your part here. One of the questions first came up is, what are the current legal access pathways for psychedelics? We hear about SAPs and Section 56s and clinical trials. How do we get there now? If people want to do these now, what's the options?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and set the stage for that. So in Canada, psychedelics are regulated under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which means that activities with those substances, such as possession, production, sales, even distribution, are essentially illegal unless authorized under the regulations or an exemption is granted. So under the current framework, the legal access pathways would be 1, through clinical trials, which is the most effective way to advance research with an unapproved drug. 2, through the Special Access Program, and as of early this year, the Special Access Program has been amended to permit access to restricted drugs like psilocybin and MDMA, of course, with the caveat that it really is to be used in emergency circumstances only, and for use of a restricted drug that has shown promise in clinical trials or have been approved in other countries, but not yet in Canada. And lastly, the third pathway is through an exemption from the CDSA, or the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And this is also known as commonly as a Section 56 exemption, But also noting that a Section 56 exemption is provided also in limited circumstances, especially now that restricted drugs are accessible through the Special Access Program. And so the Section 56 exemption mechanism is not really meant as a way to circumvent the Special Access Program or clinical trials by any means. So those are the three legal access pathways currently available in Canada for psychedelics.
Great. Thank you for that. Do you want to add anything to that, Jaspreet?
No, just really similar to that for clinical trials in other countries and jurisdictions. It is through a clinical trial pathway is access to these substances at the moment. So really, to Sherry's point, it's very restricted and controlled right now, but we still have the ability to move forward with some work.
In our experience, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like Health Canada is really pushing the SAP and Section 56 to the back burner and asking the industry to focus on the trials. Is that what you're seeing as well?
I would say that there is quite a bit, like the backlog for SAP for psilocybin is, I think, over 2,000 participants or interested parties. So, it's certainly clinical trials are the best way to access it, but we also need Health Canada to be a bit more forthcoming and amenable to reviewing CTAs, looking at clinical trials, issuing site licenses so we have more sites available, because we can't always keep going to the same investigators. We have a number of investigators in Canada that are interested. They're not naive researchers, but they don't have the appropriate, Section 56 or a dealer's license to conduct clinical trials. So that also creates a bit of a backlog when we don't have the facility. So it's a bit of a balance right now. I know they'd like to push research. We'd like to see that too, but we also can't move that ball any faster because we're still waiting on them to respond.
I really think what wasn't anticipated was when the Special Access Program opened up to restricted drugs, those patients that were in queue for the Section 56 exemptions kind of got, pushed out of that line, and Health Canada said, okay, well, now you got to reapply through the SAP program. And it wasn't as simple. There are still a lot of requirements that need to be met. There needs to be still some evidence that the practitioner will need to gather to justify use. And I think it was a lot more complicated than patients anticipated at first. So there's still a gap there, and those patients are not really, there's still an unmet need for those patients that don't exactly meet the Special Access Program.
And many of them being palliative literally died in the process. We had one that we applied for when the 56 was denied. We put it through an SAP and they passed away in the meantime. So not very effective. Yeah, I totally agree with what you guys are saying. I'm going to jump to another question, maybe for Jaspreet. Can you provide a review of the clinical trial landscape in psychedelics?
Certainly. You gave a really good review of what's currently happening based on clinicaltrials.gov. Right now, we can certainly see that trials in Europe, the United States, some in Australia and Canada are at the forefront of where the major activity is currently happening. In Canada, I just pulled up the stats from Health Canada. So there's one psilocybin study, there's one ketamine, 3 MDMA studies in Canada at the moment. And then there's 2 pending for psilocybin, 3 pending MDMA, and 1 ketamine study pending as well. And there is a current S-ketamine clinical trial happening in Canada right now. And of course, we need to look at the differences between, there's a lot of preclinical research occurring globally. There's a lot of phase 1 that is happening. I believe at last count of a majority of the psilocybin studies happening around the world, about 50% had moved to phase 2, which is exciting to see it moving that quickly. And of course, we know MDMA with the Compass trials is in phase 3, which is fantastic. But we are seeing other molecules, like LSD is certainly something that has come up in conversation with clients for the past year, including academic institutions. Sourcing product has been a bit of an issue for us, a GMP product for clinical trials. And that was resolved, thankfully, a few months ago. But I think there's tremendous amount of interest globally from researchers and institutions to get moving. So to your point as well, David, it's not fringe science anymore. This is the ability for a number of academics to get going in a number of centers. We do see that a lot of organizations are going to the United Kingdom and to Australia just because the regulatory pathways are And the regulators themselves are far more amenable to actually discussing these and getting them going, whereas the FDA sort of kind of shut the door, and Health Canada is just a lot of back and forth dialogue that does take some time. So as a quick overview, I'd say, globally it's fairly robust and busy across a number of different molecules in the background.
Anything you want to add to that, Sherry?
No, I think that the industry is really moving towards the data. And I think that now we have, really good grounds to see generally across the board with all regulators in all jurisdictions that there's a consensus that there just needs to be more data. And hopefully from the Canadian perspective that they work to become more aligned with, I think, other jurisdictions that, again, as Jaspreet had mentioned, are more agreeable to working with stakeholders and sponsors that are looking to execute on trials, and how they could really modify the framework in a way that is still has the controls and the all the standards that are required for having safety and efficacy, but still recognizing that there may need to be somewhat of a different pathway and where those differences lie, and they need to work with industry to really recognize what that is and to be able to move the industry forward.
Yeah, I'm just going to go through the chat box here quickly. There's some questions here I'm noticing. Can the panel explain the right to try? And I want to expand that a bit to saying even the harm reduction model that we have in Canada, US has got this right to try bill that's gone through it. I'm not sure if it's actually made much difference. And in Canada, we got people selling mushrooms on the street corners in Vancouver, in shops that are openly selling mushrooms. People experiencing these therapists moving to almost like a harm reduction model where they show up. Like these medicines are being used by the SCADs right now. I'm really curious, how do we convince Health Canada that this is not something that we'd like to open up? It's happening. And it's happening right next door to probably every one of us. I talked to my Uber driver yesterday, and he's full-on mushroom user, just randomly, some guy on the street. And so we're going through all this work to prove that it's safe and efficacious, and yet there's people that potentially could be harmed if it's being done in an unsafe way. So I'm curious on your perspectives on that, both the right to try and the underground and kind of harm reduction models that are being used right across the country right now.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
I can jump in, I guess, and just to see what we're seeing. We're clinical trialists. We work with physicians all day long, and our model is certainly we want to go through the clinical trial route. And same thing, we do work with a number of sort of infrastructures or clinics that are trying to balance the model of even just like ceremonial to traditional, as in we're going down the pure sort of therapeutic. You come to a psychiatrist's office and we're going to go through therapy, and the pharmacological and the psychotherapy must match and integrate together. So the therapy component has to be important. And I think, again, for Health Canada to really notice and say, we need to conduct the clinical trials in a robust manner, build treatment protocols as clinicians that we would, and then be able to translate that into a therapeutic model, is the progression that not just Health Canada, but the CMA and the CPSAs will also want to start to recognize. In terms of harm reduction, it's a difficult question to really answer, because we know the therapeutic benefit, but we also know that there is potential harm there, because these aren't controlled substances in the sense that they're not GMP. We don't know how they've been manufactured. Dosing is still a huge question. So even the studies that are going into microdosing now, because we just don't have enough clinical evidence to support it, or to even understand the mechanisms of action there. So, I know my answer is not really an answer, more of me probably adding more confusion, but, I think from my stance is the more evidence and research that we can conduct to show to the regulators, as we would in other areas of medicine. I think that's really what we have in front of them, and constantly engaging them, to Sherry's point, constantly engaging stakeholders, to bring them to the table to have these discussions and ask industry to be open with actually publishing data. Interim results of data is also critically important. Even just basics, we know that with the MDMA studies, having more integration is critical. really learning and kind of focusing on that knowledge translation is going to be critical.
Yeah, well said. Anything to add to that, Sherry?
Yeah, sorry, the light went off here, but yeah, from where our company sits, Candelta, we work with a large range of companies that are in cannabis and in psychedelics, and oftentimes, there's conversations about the medical and recreational frameworks for cannabis being referenced as potential pathways for psilocybin. And some organizations that have even gone so far as to use cannabis regulations to develop proposed regulations for psilocybin, for example, as really a means to encourage Health Canada to visualize what a framework could look like without really having to reinvent the wheel. And we see even in BC, they received a section 56 class exemption to decriminalize possession of illicit drugs for personal use. So that's actually a really huge milestone. And other provinces and other cities are looking to do something similar. And the province openly stated that, okay, we have this exemption now, and we really want to move forward with implementing a policy change and including the federal government as part of that plan as well. And then when you look to the South, to the US, you see states like Oregon that is really working diligently to release draft regulations, really to widely legalize psychedelics. So I think that things are moving really quickly in other fronts to make advances, considering harm reduction, considering that there needs to be some facilitation for therapeutic uses. But I think, despite all of these advances, Health Canada has really continuously emphasized the need for clinical trials and scientific evidence. And I think there is still a lot of value there. I'm a chemist by training, so I see that, and I recognize the validity in that. Especially when you're looking to demonstrate safety and efficacy for the purposes of, specific indications, and there's definite value in that. So I think that we're might be moving towards that, but again, the data needs to be really reflective of, again, as we were saying, the quality of the product is very important, the dosing, the consistency, and there is a different risk profiles with different molecules along the psychedelic category, and it is very different than in cannabis as well. So I think all this needs to be really taken into consideration when considering things like harm reduction and making that balance.
Well, I just came out of 3 days of sitting in a clinical trial, and the amount of data that we were collecting every hour, and then if there was anything abnormal, it'd be every 20 minutes. And it was just like, there's somebody a 5-gram mushroom trip, and they're trying to do an ECG, and they think it's taking half an hour, and they're going, how long is this going to take? And they're melting as they're holding these little instruments, and they're melting in their hands. And it was fascinating to see how trying to fit clinical trials on top of something that's not a pill, it's not a painkiller, and yet we need this data, and seeing that data come out the other end and being able to analyze it now, it's fascinating. Some things that I've never been, I always said I don't want to be a researcher, and now having done it for 3 days, it's fascinating stuff to see the practical outcome and how we now know things that we didn't know 4 days ago. It's beautiful. And you kind of answered the next question I was going to ask. Do you think the regulatory advances in other similar industries and jurisdictions could influence Health Canada to create a medical or recreational psilocybin regime in Canada? You kind of touched on that. Anything more to add to that? Either of you?
Yeah, I think that the current legal pathways, particularly the changes to the special access program to allow access for restricted drugs, it really shouldn't necessarily be perceived that there will be a medical framework or recreational framework necessarily on the horizon, at least from the regulator's perspective. And I think that as a nascent industry, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and it is getting done, and that the traditional pharmaceutical drug route for these molecules will ultimately prevail, at least until there's more safety and efficacy data to assure regulators really of patient safety.
So Dylan has a question here about microdosing. There's an article he posts in the chat box. It's an interesting one of the studies being done on microdosing. Does this spell the end of microdosing? Research seems to largely support macrodose, but microdosing is seemingly less promising. Kind of depends who you talk to. If you get Paul Stamets going on this, he will vehemently disagree with you. And others of the studies do show that it's mostly placebo action that's happening. So I'm curious about your take on that.
So from our side, it's just, we do see, both sides of the conversation, when we talked with Paul or we talk with, with Jim, like Jim Fadiman and stuff. So we do have one school of thought, and then you have another school of thought as well. But I think, again, it's, you can't just say microdosing as a whole isn't successful, or it is. You, like any sort of clinical trial or any sort of drug development program, what is the indication? What is the dose that we're looking at? What is the dose escalation or the range we're looking at? There's a lot of factors that go into this, not just to say microdosing works or it doesn't work. What is it trying to work on? Or what is a mechanism or the disease indication that we're looking to focus on? So I think that we, again, continuously look at different clinical trial protocols, look at different indications, and that's the best way to really address this. And, to Sherry's point, we are very early, we're just at the tip right now, and we still got a long way to go. And it's an exciting place to be. So I think we just need to be patient and design really, really good clinical trials. And it doesn't have to be 10 years and $1 billion to get there. I think the one good thing, and I hate to bring up COVID, but the one good thing that came out of COVID is majority of the regulators around the world created more expedited review times and processes. And the ability for us to conduct clinical trials more efficiently has certainly been a positive outcome. So it doesn't take 10 years, to get a drug to market. We could probably get through phase 2 in just a few years, which is fantastic, and even get through a microdosing study in a couple of months if we really were pressed. So there's opportunity, and I think that we just need to continue to explore it.
Our medical writer, I keep saying, why is this taking so long? He says, dude, we're going really, really fast. We got our trial done from application point in 18 months. And I'm like, this is way too long. It's like, no, often it takes years. It's like, okay. But thank you for that. Anything to add to that, Sherry?
Yeah, it really depends on the indication, as Jaspreet was saying. And, ultimately, a lot of these studies are looking at very severe conditions, right? Like severe depression, PTSD. And in those cases, perhaps that is true. Maybe a macrodose is what is the best option. But there's a category that, of wellness where it's for, maybe someone who doesn't have something so severe, but they maybe in that situation, a microdose would be more advantageous, beneficial for them. So, I think that there's the appropriate use and dose that need to be, correlated. And again, so I think that there is value in a microdose. And again, I think that obviously you need the data behind that to really be able to substantiate that. But I think that there is evidence that there is a category that's appropriate for it.
Yeah. My personal belief is that it works for some things. We've seen it work for helping people tail off of SSRIs so they could get to a macrodose. It didn't heal the depression, but it helped them titrate off with their doctor's help to that point that they could then do a macrodose. So yeah, I think you're right. It's so dependent on what is the question about, what is it being used for. Katie asks here, what needs to happen to help make or continue Canada's leadership in the space? Great question. I'm throwing at either of you can jump in on that if you like.
I can go first, I guess. I think from a leadership standpoint, is we already have, and David, kind of going back to your slides, you have majority of all the major institutions in Canada and nonprofits working towards a common goal, which is to advance science. And for the most part, it's very open science as well. And I think that's a key to collaboration. And if we look at this as, we have a medical crisis in front of us, it's been clearly identified, it's been publicized so much. So it's one of those situations, let's put our money where our mouth is. Like, we're doing all this research. How do we advance knowledge translation? How do we continue to collaborate, but do really good research? And I think that's really what it comes down to. Have extremely well-designed clinical trials, have very clear regulatory pathways to get there. And continue to work with other stakeholders and work with Health Canada, work with the CMA, and start to build those treatment protocols early so that we can share that knowledge globally with our other partners.
Yeah. Good point.
I really feel that stakeholder engagement really needs to be a focus as well with the regulator, and the idea of collaborating with the scientific community, with universities, academic institutions, organizations. I think that that's all great, but I really would like to see the regulator being more actively involved and really being up to date with the advances, right? So that they can also make, I think, positive decisions and momentum in the industry.
There's a couple comments here about New Jersey has a new psilocybin bill, S2934, best ways to start the conversation on shaping research and policy. There's a question that might come up in the next session. Actually, Michael Kidd's working a lot on these kind of discussions. But any comments on that? I think he comments earlier as well. We're moving the conversation forward here in New Jersey for psychedelic and clinical research. He mentions that they have a psilocybin bill, S2934. And we get into California where they kind of gutted the bill and just put it aside. So it's kind of fits and starts across the US that I'm seeing. I'm not American, so I don't fully follow it closely as much as Canada. But what's the best way to start the conversation on shaping research and policy? Interesting question.
I'd say from a clinical perspective, we look at epidemiology first. Where is the research needed? What are disease indications in our states would be a good place from a clinical perspective to start. But then also it's patient engagement. So look at your stakeholders, your nonprofits, your organizations who have been advocates and supporters of pushing this forward, and really understand what is sort of the pulse and what's needed to shape policy. So what is the data that you require to help inform policymakers and decision makers to move any actual access forward? Because doing research is great, but what are we doing it for? And who is it there to help? So it's sort of a 30,000 foot question, but I think you just need to start from the top and start to work your way down to narrow the focus.
Yeah, and from the policy perspective, being really clear on what the objectives of that department that that's housing the policy, and being aligned with their overall objectives and mandate, and making sure that there are clear goals to be able to have that conversation with the policymakers.
Yeah, and I feel like bottom line, what are politicians concerned about? They want to get reelected. And so the more we have these conversations and the more they do polls and see that there's actually an overwhelming majority of people that want these medicines available, I think that's going to be the tipping point. And how do we do that? I think every little conversation we have, and the more influential those conversations go up the ladder, I think the more impact they're going to have on convincing leaders that they need to get on board with this work in order to get reelected. It's really bottom line for them. So thank you. Swati says, I agree, Sherry, microdosing has always had relevance as a wellness practice, or will always have relevance as a wellness practice product. Consumer, business to consumer products are the future here, in my opinion. Thank you, good comment. Getting back into trials, what are the common misconceptions and challenges of conducting psychedelic trials? That's a great question.
So that's a really good question. I think when we look at the unsexy side of running research, I think that everybody assumes that you're going to have a lot of people who are interested to be patients, but we have very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria, and recruitment may not be as simple. So, just thinking that you have a community of enthusiasts behind you doesn't mean that they're going to be perfect research candidates and participants. So really looking at where do you want to run your research is critical. So again, coming back down to the regulatory jurisdiction and the pathways, accessing investigational product and making sure that from the product standpoint, not only is it GMP, but the manufacturer is willing to give you and provide you with all your IMPD and CMC documentation for the regulator as well. As in most jurisdictions, that's basically where it can start and stop very quickly if you can't even provide these basic documents. The site itself, so site feasibility and recruitment is critical. This comes down to countries that require licensure and certifications to actually host controlled substance clinical research. Blinding is an issue as well. So Compass was able to blind, and that's always going to be an issue. So, what is the effectiveness of blinding in a clinical trial using psychedelics. And I will also say that one of the issues that we've run into in the past, excuse me, with sponsors is access to psychotherapists. We actually have not had enough, where we've had to move countries for the clinical trials because we couldn't train enough psychotherapists in the time frame that we needed to. And that is an issue because, again, for research, it can't be just anybody who would like to be a psychotherapist. You typically have to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist based on that region's sort of medical classification of who can actually provide that therapy. And I think that just the expectations need to be tempered. It may not work for everybody. We know with any pharmaceuticals, clinical trials fail. We know that therapies fail on most individuals as well. So I think sort of the misconceptions is that it's going to work, it's going to be fantastic, everyone will want to participate. And I think just sort of the basics is always how long it takes and how much money it takes to run a clinical trial. So you need to be extremely realistic about, even just down to picking your CRO, picking your sites, picking your investigators, knowing what your end goal is. So if your strategy as an organization, so for commercial research is, I want to sell my molecule after phase 2, there's a very specific plan, and even your protocols will dictate how you will get there. If your plan is to commercialize your drug, you need to start thinking like pharma, whereas when we're in phase 1 starting to develop your study, we need to think about that markets. Are you looking to commercialize in Europe? Are you coming to the States? Is your phase 3 going to be a multi-center, multinational study? These are all things that people need to consider very, very early on. They cannot be last minute considerations. So that's from our personal experience running these studies so far, and that's what I would just probably share.
Yeah, great answers there. Anything to add to that, Sherry?
I think Jaspreet summed it up pretty well. I think she covered a lot of it. The study design, we work with companies that are developing different molecules, different products, and applying for clinical trials throughout Canada and other jurisdictions as well. And they also run into a lot of those same problems, right? How do you design a study that will account for things like emotional openness in an environment where there's emotional openness? How do they account for placebos when the blinding effect is less, effective in a situation like that? So there are a lot of different challenges depending on the molecules that they're looking for. For example, looking at raw biomass if you're studying psilocybin versus a synthetic, and with consistencies like with that and what parameters need to be addressed to be able to meet the needs of things even like GMP.
Yeah, good points. There's a question in the box here. What does the future look like for public access? Do you guys have a crystal ball? When do you think the public will actually get access to these medicines?
Yeah, that's everyone's question.
We do, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I honestly think that we're still some years away from that. I don't think that there's going to be open, unfacilitated access for quite a while. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you agree with that, Jaspreet, or not. But.
I 100% agree. It's going to, where we are now with clinical trials, we know that it'll be at least, say, 5 years realistically, if anything were to get through, a regulator to hit the market, perhaps. And for open access, I think it's doubtful to consider that that's going to be something on the horizon for a few years. There's an opportunity, but again, we still need to produce enough evidence to show that even, say, for microdosing, that it's safe, it's efficacious, but then how do you regulate where the product comes from? So what is considered legal access and what products fall under that category? So what is a government willing to say? Totally go for it, everyone have fun. But these are the only products we're allowing into the country that meet our safety profiles, because we still need to protect the safety of Canadian citizens. So it's definitely a crystal ball question. Like even if you look at places like Oregon, they're working so hard for their legalization, but it's still a bit of a messy situation because now it's not an amenable place to do research. It's a great place to do observational, but it's not a good place to do clinical research. So it really is jurisdictionally where you want to go. I think it's up to governments to decide, but yeah, I see it years away.
And that's what some of Health Canada's reps told us. We screwed up on cannabis because then the research stopped.
Yep.
And so we want the research. We want to know what these things do. We want the data before we make it available. So there is that breaks there that are holding things back. I've been saying 2 years now for about 4 years. And we don't know. And all of a sudden something could change. All of a sudden there's a change in the MAID bill with access for palliative care that could happen within months or not. We just don't know. Question in the box: should there be reciprocity component to any research being conducted, especially with compounds like iboga, even if synthetically manufactured, produced? Yeah, interesting question. More of a application than a research question, but it's an interesting observation of what.
Yeah, and I think that would be great. I don't know what that would look like in practice, what that compensation would look like, but yeah, I think that if that could be worked in, that would be great. And even the state of Oregon has a lot of challenges too around a similar type of conversation and around the traditional use and permitting organizations that are traditionally involved in that to still participate in a meaningful way. Considering that they're still looking to have restrictions on where some of these locations could be. And if you're, for example, using these different compounds in a certain location in a traditional sense, and it doesn't fit within that framework of where it is permitted, then that poses a problem, right? And how do you compensate those people for that lost opportunity as well? So I think, yeah, all of those nuances need to be built into a framework if we ever do move in a direction like that.
One more question from the vault here. From your experience, do you feel that Health Canada is regulating or approving clinical trials with psilocybin differently than for non-psilocybin or non-psychedelic clinical trials? What are some of the challenges?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, clinical trials, still ultimately remain the best method to advance our knowledge about products with possible medical benefit. And all clinical trials require that the investigational product can be administered in a consistent quality and delivers a consistent dose so that the results are reliable. And this is achieved by manufacturing products according to the applicable GMP standard. So with psilocybin specifically, although research into the therapeutic potential of psilocybin continues to advance through several well-designed studies, I would say that there's still currently a limited number of good quality research based on evidence on therapeutic benefits using psilocybin mushrooms instead of the purified or synthetic psilocybin.
Has there been any studies on that yet? Do you know of that compared
with raw mushroom?
Yeah,
I'm
not aware of any, but
there are some studies that are being done. I think Filament Health has
Okay.
a study in the US. There's obvious challenges for clinical trials because of the potential variability in the content of active ingredients, the potential impurities among different mushroom cultivars, potential variability generally through the mushroom tissue matrix. So, all this affects the API, it affects the levels of impurities, which ultimately could impact the product meeting GMP requirements that are necessary for a clinical trial. So the core clinical trial application requirements certainly need to be met. There is a standard that needs to be met, including manufacturing, characterization data. You need to have all that in as part of the application, analytical methods, method validation, all of that. So with that said, because of the lack of data, currently for some molecules, there will naturally be a focus on the study design with specific considerations to things like participant safety and therapist use in an environment where there is emotional openness that's harder to control, and the placebos are also a challenge, being less effective potentially for blinding. And again, if the sponsor is using mushrooms over purified synthetic psilocybin, you'd have to also do further testing, look at things like microbial contamination, aflatoxins, things like that. So, I think that Health Canada is not necessarily regulating or approving clinical trials differently, but I do think that there really are important aspects or unique aspects that need to be taken into consideration for psychedelics. So for this reason, the preclinical trial application meetings that is part of the process with Health Canada. I think that's really important to really engage in those meetings, to have a conversation with Health Canada to ensure that there is a clear path for the study, and if there are any modifications or parameters that need to be adjusted, that's accounted for. So I mean, there are a significant number of companies, universities, other institutions that are making really promising strides with research and clinical trials and different therapies as well, not just in Canada, but also in the US and globally. So even though that there are challenges, there are important advances still being made.
Yeah. So we have 1 minute left, and I'm going to throw this at you, 30-second answer. In your opinion, what do the next 5 years of psychedelic research look like?
I'll just go real quick. So very optimistic, we're just really starting off. So, there's a lot of clinical trials. There's a lot of molecules and compounds that are in preclinical. And I really think that as long as we are open and can collaborate, we have a long way to go, but a very positive, bright future ahead. And hopefully in 5 years, we can see some commercialization starting to happen.
I love it. Thank you. Sherry.
Yeah, it's a really positive drive. I think moving forward, there's a lot of interest globally, so not just in Canada, around the world, and with the different regulators as well. So I see now we're at a spot where I think there are going to be faster advances. There's a lot of capital starting to go into the industry as well that really needs to fuel it, with collaboration with universities as well. So there's a lot of credible support from a lot of different avenues globally as well. So I really see us moving forward in a positive direction.
Awesome. Great chatting with you both. Thank you so much for your insight and the work you're doing in this space. Much appreciated. And I'll turn it back to you, Brooke.
Thank you
so much.
Awesome. Really thought-provoking dialogue from our panelists here. So huge thank you to David, Sherry, and Jaspreet for that incredible insight on the industry landscape. So our second and final panel of the day is the PR and branding panel, moderated by our own Katie Pringle. Our speakers are Michael Kidd, principal and founder of Kidder Group, and Corey Firth, chief storyteller of Nikian Foundation. If the speakers would like to join me and introduce themselves, and we can get started.
Thanks, Brooke.
Sorry, go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, we're just, you'll be pinned up here in just a sec, Michael, along with Corey, but let's start with you. We've got your overview, but we'd love to hear a little bit more about your background and what you're working on.
Talking to me or Corey?
Talking to you, Michael.
Okay. I see Corey sitting there with that fantastic background. So I put a willow tree in mine. It's fake, but I do love it. I just bought it off Facebook Marketplace and I love it. So anyways, Michael Kidd with Kidder Group. I'm based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm a transplant from Ontario, Miss Ontario, but it's certainly nice being out here in Atlanta, Canada. First of all, I want to thank Marigold for putting on this presentation. I think we've had a great relationship over the last couple of years. You do great work in this space, and I love your the way you innovate and tackle the market from a PR perspective. It's very important, and the work you do is fantastic. So thanks for having me on today. So, my firm is really based around multiple things. You're looking at communications, investor relations, government relations. I know we had some really good discussion, and I've heard Sherry talk a few times about regulatory affairs and the impact it's having on the industry. And what my firm basically looks at is how we can work with companies on what we call regulatory communications issues, identifying what some of the niche issues are within industry, the opportunities to work with companies, to work with not-for-profits and foundations to tell their stories in a more efficient and effective way. And I guess one of the things that I always like doing, having been in PR and GR, for the last 20 plus years, is always taking recent experiences There's nothing worse than, thinking back to your PR school days when you'd have the same people coming in talking, using the same examples all the time. So really, I wanted to hopefully get to impart some of the knowledge I've gained in the last 2.5 years in this space, much like what Marigold and the folks over there have done, is kind of transition from cannabis. I really didn't come from cannabis. I came from a totally different part of healthcare, but certainly when I saw psychedelics, I knew there was a lot of holes and gaps that needed to be filled around regulatory policy, and especially around communications, and really trying to bridge and connect some of the things. And I'll talk a bit about medical assistance in dying and psychedelics in a few minutes, but really identifying some of those issues and core values that we could bring together to tell that story at a broader national and international level. So that's what I do.
Thank you, Michael. Over to you, Corey.
Yeah, good segue, Mike, on the storytelling stuff. My name's Corey. I'm the Chief Storytelling Officer at Nicaean. Nicaean Foundation is one of the world's leading charities funding clinical research and education programming around psychedelic and advancement of psychedelic research and therapy. We've used our resources in the past funding a lot of different science and clinical deployment of psychedelics and psychedelic research, funding the first psychedelic psychotherapy research center with the University Health Network. And today we've turned our attention towards education with Health Canada and the government starting to get involved in terms of grants for funding some of that research. We thought that it would be nice to sort of fill the gap on education. And the gap that we saw was education coming from academia is great. A lot of amazing education coming from that side of things and from those that have been around for a while. But the element that we thought was missing was the story. So we're really trying to meet the science with the story and fill that gap on the emotional side of things, because for a lot of folks that are looking at psychedelics, they can't read the academic papers that are coming out. They also are seeing what's going on in the media, and that's typically pretty polarizing. It's either the good or the bad, and there's the in-between isn't really there. And so what we're trying to do is fill that gap with storytelling, and our whole concept is about the idea of transforming out loud. We believe that if you transform out loud, then you prevent others from suffering in silence, and that our stories are a big component. Everybody's story that has been involved in psychedelics since way beyond any of the stuff that's happening today. So it's important for us to tell those stories, get those stories out, and leverage them. We think we can leverage them as part of what helps to create regulations and create access. And so that's me. I'm dropping in from Kingston, traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee people and the Anishinaabe Nation. My background is in communications. I was also the first executive director of the Psychedelic Association of Canada, formerly the Canadian Psychedelic Association. Have a lot of love for the nonprofits as I continue in that space. And I'm excited to be here today. I've worked with Marigold a little bit and a lot of folks on this call, and excited to jump in and talk about branding and communications, as it's a big passion and something that I think is still evolving in the space, like everything else. So excited to jam with Mike and you, Katie. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. I already introduced myself kind of off the hop, but I'd love to talk just a little bit more about what the team over at Marigold does. We're really proud of the team and the culture that we've built. We're in an ever-changing environment. As I mentioned, we started in cannabis in 2016, and we've been learning psychedelics since 2019. And I always position it as learning because, boy, there is so much to take in, to learn and understand as an industry. And then we'll talk a little bit too about, what the media is doing to help or hinder moving some of the dialogue and those stories along. We do a lot of traditional communications in any sort of compliant environment. Pharma goes through it, cannabis goes through it, all the kind of regulated environments need to communicate in a certain way. And also really they look to media to leverage that halo and that voice in a very specific way, which we'll dig into a little bit. And it is challenging. And so I really pat everyone on the back who has worked in a regulated environment and, a startup fueled regulated environment presents all of its own challenges, building trust and authority with both clients and the public. So a place I thought we could start is around branding. And, you know, for a lot of people who are joining us today, communications, PR, marketing isn't their background. And for a lot of people, when they think of a brand, they think of the visual identity. So they think of a logo, or they think of, you know, the way something might look on their website. And that is definitely a component. But I think something we all have in common is the way that we contribute to brand through key messaging and communication. So I wanted to throw to you first, Corey. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you use storytelling to move a brand forward, and what are some of the considerations that you put into place when you're developing that story?
Yeah, good point on the elements of what a brand is. We think of design a lot. My thoughts on branding is that branding is the art of alignment. And it starts with language first and then the actual creative. So for me, it's really about getting the language right. Storytelling is such an easy framework to kind of wrap all of this around, because storytelling has been around and been really what's documented civilization's next steps since the beginning of time. It's very primal. And I like to just come back to just primal things. There's a lot of technology these days. There's a lot of things and ways to communicate, but all of it is just a language exchange. There's a creative element to it, of course, but we typically will take that creative piece and convert it into language in our minds. So it always still starts with language for me. So that's where I always start. So there's a lot of brands will create these nice brand style guides and things like that, but we also need a language guide with that. That's kind of one element of it. I think in terms of branding, outside of storytelling, I always come back to Seth Godin's concept around purple cow. And so if you're not familiar with that theory, it's essentially, the analogy is like if you're driving through a pasture and you see all these cows out in the field and you saw a purple cow, it would obviously stand out to you. And so the idea is to try to think of like, what would be your purple cow? What's that thing that helps you stand out? And the best example, it's not psychedelic related, but it's Domino's. They came up with the idea of like 30 minutes or it's free guarantee. And that really kind of let them stand out. And you can go over the data and the stats from that time. I can't remember exactly when they did it, but the stats for them profit wise went up tremendously. And now you see every pizza shop that's ever opened has that guarantee, and it all came from that. So that's one big thing before I get into the story. But really for me, the storytelling thing is it's all about bringing value. David talked about it in the beginning about what each company offers, and there's all talk about the clinical trials that are being done, all the training programs that are being done, how we're going to deliver all this. And at the end of the day, we don't really have it all figured out yet. And so what we have to try to do is figure out what that thing is that differentiates us. And to me, it's figuring out what the customer wants first. So who are you really attracting here? Because there are many different categories of people that we're talking about serving here with all of these medicines and these organizations that are coming up. So what do they want? Who are they and what do they want is kind of step one. And then we need to figure out what their problem is. And then trying to figure out ourselves being the organizations, ourselves as a guide, not the healer, not the one that's going to fix everything, but that we're coming in here and representing this agreement together. If they're signing up and they're paying for something, there is an exchange of value there. But what is it that you're offering as a guide to help get that person to wherever they want to be? And that's kind of the ending piece, is like understanding transformation. What is the transformation that you provide? That's the key in all of this, in all branding, in my opinion. Everything is about transformation. You're taking them from one place to another, and telling the story of what that transformation looks like is the way you reach the hearts of those you're talking to. And there's no better industry for that, in my opinion, than psychedelics. And so I really think that if we can start to think more about who the person is we're trying to reach and what their transformation looks like, then we can really start to tell the proper story. And then that shows up in all kinds of different ways. Like I said before, it's language. So figuring out ways to write blog content, news articles, things like that, it all comes out of that afterwards. And so there's a whole framework that I follow that creates all that. But those are my opinions about it anyway.
Thank you. Michael, when you're thinking about developing brands and key messages for your clients and supporting them with that work, what's your approach, and where do you recommend people start when they're thinking about these pieces?
Well, I think Corey hit someone on, we're all talked about language. I'm more I'm more about the emotional connection. If you don't have a passion or a connection to a specific brand or to an idea, it's very difficult to be able to communicate that. And that's what communications is. There's a difference between logic and emotion. And I don't come from a medical or science background. My background is in psychology and in public relations and communications. So what I'm certainly on the political and government side as well. So what I'm always looking for, if I'm trying to establish a brand in a marketplace, I'm looking for the issues that connect and help you deliver what it, to provide the solution to what the problem actually is. And I think that's one of the things as I meet with my clients and speak with my clients all the time. It's, we're always looking at competitor intelligence. What are your competitors doing? How are they defining themselves in the market space? So, do you want to be responsive to that, or do you want to be proactive and lead in certain aspects of the market? And to Corey's point, I think psychedelics is a huge open space right now. Are you a product developer? Are you a clinical trial specialist? There's so many different venues and avenues for development in this space. And really, it's about differentiating and finding what it is that you're passionate about and how you're actually going to fit into that space. Because if you try to be multiple things to multiple people, you just will fail. And that's just a simple, answer. I'm a pretty straightforward guy when it comes to communication. So, I think with my clients, I'm very upfront with them. If I see something where there's something in the media and you're seeing reporters talking a lot about a certain, let's talk about end of life therapy, for example. There's a lot of discussion around that. So how does our brand, how does our narrative fit with that? Do we want to get involved in that? It's really understanding where you fit and what you're most passionate about. And that's where the brand really speaks through for me.
For sure. I love that. So, to recap a little bit, like it's around understanding your competitors, understanding your USP, your unique offer in the space, really understanding who you're speaking to, and leveraging emotion and connection and audience to really drive that forward. The one layer I'd also add is really understanding your values and what your brand stands for and what your company stands for. Because when you understand your values and you can pass that through to your team members, it acts as a filter to help with decision making. So does this topic seem like it aligns with our values? Does this cause feel like it aligns with our values? It really helps to put a filter on how you make decisions and what the fit for your company and for your brand. So kind of back to the, I'm going off script a little bit, but sort of back to the media comment there, Michael. I'd love to talk about what we think the media, how we think they're doing a good job conveying what's going on in the industry and where we feel there are challenges. And I know you have some feelings on this, so I wanted to throw to you first on that question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thank you for that, Katie. One of the issues in any emergent space is you're going to be flooded. It's going to be flooded with a lot of press release journalism, and we're seeing a lot of that happen today. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because there has to be a narrative that is certainly channeled through to help public understand and consume the information that's coming out of the space, whether that's on the science or the government and policy side. So, I'm of the mindset that media is doing the best job it possibly can. I look at folks like Psychedelic Spotlight. I see Swati here. Some of the work that Patrick's doing over at Microdose Buzz. There's a real niche opportunity to be telling the story. The question is, do you want to consistently be driving your message through these outlets like INN and Psychedelic Spotlight, because we're trying to reach a broader audience? So, I think from the traditional side, there's a lot of work that has to be done. I think in some cases, traditional media is pretty lazy when it comes to telling the actual story and finding what really drives policy, what's really driving the overall narrative in psychedelics right now. But again, I think on the niche media side, like the Psychedelic Spotlights, they really, really understand it because they come from a cannabis background or a science background or medical background, and really can identify and tell the story in a unique way. And I've said this from day one, I don't think psychedelics has a science problem, it has a communications problem. And part of that is really connecting and helping the public understand what an end-of-life cancer patient is going through and why they need psychedelic assisted therapy, and then translating that into the policy front with governments who make the decisions and try to move that policy from place to place. But again, media traditionally is lazy. It's very competitive, and I think what we have to do as PR practitioners is tell that story and keep redefining and finding ways to tell the story, not the same way, but in a more constructive and positive way. So I know Corey probably has some stuff to add to that from McKeon's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I won't speak directly from McCain's perspective because I don't want to sound like I speak for them in this, but I'll try to keep it brief because I could talk about this all day long. But I just want to pick up from the idea that you dropped there, Mike. I would agree too that psychedelics has a branding problem. It's still, weirdly enough, in this turn on, tune in, drop out narrative of the 60s and 70s. I see it all over the place. I see terrible journalism just trying to grab headlines to feed the algorithms, and they're just trying to get eyeballs to sell ad dollars, and it's not really media, in my opinion, and that's unfortunately, part of what we're having to break through here as we enter a new paradigm of how these things can help us evolve, not just our biomedical model, but also the way we communicate things. And that's a broad blanket statement. I'm not saying that about anyone on this call. I would agree with what you were saying, Mike, about Psychedelic Spotlight. And there's some really great journalists doing some amazing things. Kurt Petrovich, for example, is an amazing journalist doing incredible things, but he's also done his own work with these medicines and has his own experiences. So I think, if I could just say anything to anyone in the media, is go have a trip, go see what it's like. So that maybe if you're writing about it and you don't quite fully understand it, instead of maybe looking for that thing that's going to get the click, you could actually sort of reach the folks like Mike's talking about that really have a heart in this. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and I hope that wasn't too overly constructive.
Katie, if I could just quickly add to that, I mean, there's always this discussion about, do we use social media or do we use traditional media? And I want to point out, Simon last year took out a National Post cover wrap ad, and it was highly, highly effective. And I, to this day, put them up as in terms of the standard of really helping to shape and define and open eyes in terms of what is actually happening in the psychedelic space. They did the industry a big service when they did that. So, huge props to them. They're not a client of mine. I just wanted to say I've always enjoyed how they've done their media work. So yeah, again, you have to look at the earned side versus the unearned side and how that really translates into your overall strategy.
Before we move on, do you want to clarify what you mean by earn and unearned for?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Are you paying for ad space, or are you working with journalists to really tell the story to get them to publish your opinion and or just your story, the company story? So yeah.
A couple
and there's
questions.
Benefits to both.
For sure, like advertorial versus straight up PR, and your ability to control the message. And so we've got a few questions here that I'll actually throw to you. So from our friend Russell, who's head of content over at Psych. So he has an interesting perspective because he's getting pitched by people like us all over the world all the time. And so a couple questions. So we'll start with the first one here. How can drug developers keep communications alive and share prices buoyant when meaningful news can be sparse? And we know that as communicators, sometimes we're trying to create something where it's a little bit more difficult and there isn't as much going on. And Russell, I would even welcome you if you wanted to comment based on some of the feedback from Michael and Corey. I'd welcome you to jump on here. So what are your thoughts, Michael, on that in terms of ongoing communications and meaningful news?
It's a brilliant question. Thank you for that, Russell. It is the bane of my existence, trying to always find ways to shape that story. Some companies, just going back to the brand, have assets that they can leverage. So, for example, I think of one of my clients being Optimi Health, owned by JJ Wilson, whose father is Chip Wilson with Lululemon. So is that a good enough connection or draw to bring that into what we're doing on a drug development or a product development side? So you're always trying to find these little pieces that a journalist might hook onto. In most cases, less than 10% they work. So again, I think this is a situation where relationships are key. Establishing those upfront relationships are key. That's what will eventually get you some of those stories, and finding out what's different. From a drug developer's perspective, it's boring stuff. I'm sitting back with some of my clients watching their share value, go up and down, and then you have Michael Pollan, you have Netflix and Amazon and all these big pieces coming out with Netflix, and then you're starting to see more of that narrative pick up, and therefore stock values will start to increase. So you're really trying to judge and understand, what are these issues that are helping to drive not just the message, but to drive share prices as well. And then how do you take that and spin off to work with a reporter like yourself or a news agency like yourself to say, hey, Pollan's doing this, he's talking about this. Did you know that we're doing that as well, but in this different context? I think that's one of the best ways to keep the story alive.
Right. And tagging on to this, I'll throw to you, Corey, because we'll get to the conversation around kind of integrity and community and stuff like that in a minute. Which one I know is one of the topics you wanted to cover. But I think this fits nicely into this question around, are we at risk of overstating and leveraging the media to overstate where we're actually at with psychedelic medicines? And is there, what can we do to make sure that that isn't happening and that we've got a lot of integrity behind the work that we're putting out?
Yeah, I think just to keep it really quickly, we need to tell all sides of the story. There's good, bad, and ugly in every industry, and especially in every drug industry. I mean, we saw it throughout COVID. We saw the ups and downs of the good, the bad, and the ugly there in terms of big pharma. And all of a sudden, we went from criticizing big pharma to trusting big pharma implicitly. And the story from bad to good there is an interesting one. Some of it saved us, some of it has hurt us from some people's perspectives. And we had the same thing here. And there's going to be good stories, there's going to be bad stories, and we have to be honest. And I think as a community, if we're all here and we all consider ourselves part of what we think to be those that are advancing psychedelics to this next phase, we're all responsible for the bad. And so we all have to be honest about the story, and we all have to come and talk about that together and keep the dialogue open and not criticize and not put anyone down and not shame anyone. These compounds teach us to accept everything as is. And I think that's part of what we have to ground in on as we continue to advance here.
Thank you. And back on that community front, can we talk a little bit about building a community, what it means for the industry, and some of the challenges around artificial community building?
Yeah. There's. Oh, sorry. Was that for me or for Mike?
Well, why don't we start with you, Corey, and then we'll go to Mike.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think the interesting thing right now that everyone is grappling with, especially those that are publicly traded, is making profits. They're trying to figure out how to be profitable without regulations, and they're trying to come up with new creative ways to do that. And so I have no judgments towards them with this comment, but I would just be careful around the idea of community, because to me, community is not a profit-based thing. Community in its earliest form was all about survival. And so I think the goal for communities is about helping people meet a survival need and to give without expectation. And the best version of community in relation to psychedelics is Burning Man. And their whole foundation is about showing up with what you have and a little bit more to give away so that you can be there of support for someone in need. And so I think if we can try to figure out what that looks like, and I know that sounds grandiose and maybe a little esoteric and woo-woo and like utopian, I'm an optimist, so I'll go there and I'm not afraid to go there, but that's what I think about. And I'm actually currently building a center here in Kingston, Ontario, and we're trying out this donation-based model for our community to see if we can trust that those that are there will give more than they have to be able to make sure that someone else has the support or the access that they need. And so it's been a really interesting test so far. We're actually, in terms of the modeling of the profits, we're actually making we're projecting and we're seeing like 3 times more from donations than we would have if we priced it the way we thought we should price it. So it's really interesting to see. I think that the psychedelic community and those that have had experiences, they want to give back so people can have more access and more availability. So I guess to root it in, I also, and I hate to name drop, but I was talking with Rick Doblin yesterday, and we were talking about fear and death and things like that. And he brought up this idea that he believes that people are more afraid of losing their tribe or being kicked out of their tribe than they are about actually dying. And I think if we look at that and we look at the idea of being part of a tribe or being part of a community, we have to hold that sacred. And that would be kind of my last comment on community.
Mm-hmm. Michael, over to you. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll keep it short, but community is we're having a hard time with community in this space right now because there's so many varying opinions, so many varying ways, whether it's you're trying from a not-for-profit perspective, trying to find affordability and accessibility for patients who should have legally the legal right to access these medications and experiences, to companies who wish to profit from this because they have an obligation and a passion, as I spoke about a few minutes ago, to change the world in a different space. So I think, when we look at community, it's such a broad term, and it's one that I think is misrepresented quite often. A community doesn't have to be about making profit or just being part of an overall holistic community and providing medicine by nature. I'm of the mindset that we have a lot of work ahead of us. Somebody said earlier that they felt that stakeholders were coming together for one cause. I would disagree with that. I think there are a lot of different voices out there who are contributing in positive ways, in ways that might be a little more distracting, if you will. So, and again, that's this space is in its infancy. We have to find what that is, and it's going to take time. It's going to take a few years, but I think the expectations for community to be all about raising money, because money has to be raised in order to continue to produce some of these medicines, and really trying to find a way to integrate them into our societies, into our policies, is important. But at the same time, I look at the folks like Thomas Hartle out there who is literally putting his life on the line to continue to develop that message and to build and grow his community, which encompasses all of us. So, there's a lot to be done still. One thing I will mention, and I don't know if David mentioned it earlier, but we are putting together some of the best thinkers, I think, a group of individuals to help work with Health Canada to establish a ministerial advisory panel. Why do we do that? Because we want to have representation from all over the space. And are we going to get everything? No, but this establishes a front game for industry to be working hand in hand with the minister and his and her offices to have the discussion with the public, the consultation that will help broaden that community, so that when policy does come down the road, that everybody has a piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We've covered quite a few things so far. So, building a brand through communications beyond a visual identity. We've talked a little bit about some of the challenges with the current media landscape. Michael, I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about the differences in the types of communication. So, for example, we're a PR firm, we're focused on PR, but we also get people coming to us asking us for GR support and IR, which is different than what we do. So could you clarify a little bit around the differences between those practices and how they relate to the industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of work in all three. So PR, public relations, government relations, and investor relations, and it's hard to manage all three and to be good at all three. So, one of the things I liked about the agency model is you can have in-house expertise in those varying disciplines. But I think today you have to have a good, and I think if there's any advice I can impart on anyone here who's listening, it is, if you're a lawyer, don't stay in the courtroom, get out of the courtroom. If you're a doctor, get out of the lab, or a researcher, get out of the lab. If you're a communicator, get out of the newsroom, get out of your office, because you have to learn so many disciplines. You have to be multidisciplinary in terms of your understanding of business and policy if you want to be in this space. I'm not a lawyer, but I understand regulatory communication. I understand how to communicate with a politician. I've met some brilliant lawyers, off the chart brilliant, much smarter, way smarter than me, but they can't get out of their pigeonholed existence to understand that there's other ways to communicate and draw policy down. So I think that's the best advice I could give to that question, Katie, is If you're a good PR person and you want to effectively communicate, stick with that, but understand also what drives investors to make the decisions that they make, what drives politicians to make the decisions that they make. And that's based on theory, that's based on practice, and really it's about understanding how they can bring those together to affect change. I don't want to be I don't want to ruffle any feathers here, but I'm 48 years old, and if you had said to me 3 or 4 months ago that I would live to see the day that Roe versus Wade was overturned, I would have told you you're completely out of your mind. I just never ever had the vision to see that happen. But that happens because people get out of their own bubbles and really work together to drive change. So, whether you agree with or disagree with it, I'm not saying I have an opinion on it, but just seeing the landscape change comes from that real grassroots communications, legal policy, and working together and understanding how to bring that all together within your own skill set.
And Corey, I'm hoping maybe you could speak a little bit to this notion that every company has the ability to be a version of a media company and to produce content and be a resource. So what are your thoughts around that and how it can relate to change with the government or change from an positive change from an investor landscape?
Yeah, I mean, it just sorry, can you repeat the question? Maybe ask it in a different way. Sorry.
I think I asked like 4 questions that way.
Yeah.
So the first one was around the potential. Let's start there. The potential for content and for companies to establish themselves as a version of a media company through content.
Yeah, every company is a media company. So starting to act like it, and every branding person like what Mike was saying is about getting out of the lab. Like there's the constant sort of conditioning belief of like stay in your own lane. I know that was growing up was like stay in your lane, like stay in your lane, stay in what you know. I don't really believe in that. Like if you're in the forest and you're following a path, like go off a little bit and grab an acorn and see where that can grow. And I think using that analogy from a branding perspective and from the marketing department is like go and talk with the CEO and learn his story. What is he really doing or she doing to advance things? Go into the medical side and learn about what's going on at the lab so that you can advance the story from that perspective. And I just think in general, everybody and everybody involved in this movement, we'll call it for now, I guess, that's producing any sort of content, whether you're an organization or a blog writer or a journalist, I think you have the responsibility to be as open and transparent as possible. And that includes everything from how you make money to how your practices during your trials and everything in between. And the more honest and open we are about that kind of stuff in our writing and in our communications, I think will show Health Canada that we're trying our best here. And we're trying to do this in the safest way possible. And I know that that's really what Mike is really rooted in his communications with Health Canada and everything he's done so far. So.
Mm-hmm. And thanks for that. Just one quick point to that. Investors, know your audience, folks. Your investors are, whether they're invested in your company privately or publicly, you have to communicate with them. I've worked with clients who kind of forgot about their investors, whether they're public or private, and they come to me and say, "We need you to solve this because we haven't talked to our investors in months, and we don't know what the heck to say to them." So you have to have ongoing communication and dialogue with any type of investor or stakeholder, because if you don't, you will fail. Your company will fail. There's no question about that. And again, it comes down to knowing who you are as a media company as well. Do you want to be Red Light Holland and having $100 million market cap and being able to afford to bring in someone like Wiz Khalifa to promote your product? Or do you want to be like an Optimi who doesn't have a $100 million market cap and work with Thomas Hartle to push a branded product? So there's all kinds of ways you have to find what fits for you.
Yeah. Let's get tactical for a second. So, what are some of the good examples you've seen of people leveraging community or communications or PR or media to really build their brand? Michael, I thought the Optima grand opening was really cool, and some of the people they worked with to tell the story and build it out on social, I thought was a pretty amazing access. I know one of the challenges in our space is there's a lot you can't say. There's a lot that you can't share about the work you're doing, but I thought it was a creative way to sort of break through and be able to tell a story.
Well, thank you for that. And that was a difficult story to tell, because how do you make a 20,000 square foot drug processing facility the star of the show? And that was the question we kept asking. And really, it came down to what we've been talking about all along: is community. Media will always buy into community if community is invested. So, I've seen some really creative things done. Red Light Holland just launched a microsite on, I think it's Red Light Oregon, maybe it might be called. I'm not sure, but really cool idea, because what they're basically signaling is, hey, we're getting into Oregon, we know what's happening over there, so we want to start to have a piece of that pie. I love that idea, I love that strategy. And Corey's working with Sanjay Singhal and the Kayan Foundation now. Sanjay is an incredible human being who has an incredible story to share. And I love what he's done with McCain, Linda Medeiros, and his team over there. Now Corey on that team. They've done a great job of really identifying and investing in companies who are trying to develop molecules for the right reasons. And Sanjay is an incredible philanthropist and entrepreneur who has a really good story to tell. And so I think he's done that very, quite successfully. And I mentioned the Cybin piece earlier. I think the field trip and the work they've done, we all have challenges, but folks like Ron and Levy, there's just a lot of really innovative things that you could do in this space, and the sky's the limit.
Cool. And what about you, Corey? Who do you think's doing a good job? Any examples?
Yeah, I have to give Mike a lot of credit. You might not know this about Mike based on the fake plant behind him, but he's a very creative guy, and he's really connected to what's happening here in the space. And he's doing a lot of amazing things, often behind the scenes and often from his own pocket to make these things happen. I have to say the connection between you and Thomas Hartle that I've been able to watch behind the scenes, you kind of lift him up and help get his story front and center is incredible. So I just want to give you some love, Mike, for everything you've done. We met when I was at the Psychedelic Association, and he really helped, because nonprofits, they don't have a lot of resources. And so he stepped up and put a lot of time and effort into what we were doing with some of the work we did with our memorandum of regulatory approval, which had a big impact on what we did to get this where we're at today with the special access program. So Mike is doing a lot of amazing things, and we need guys like Mike that are willing to support at every level of the space, not just the for-profit space. So it's the medical assistance in dying community. It's the nonprofits, the for-profits, because we need them too. No matter what some people might say, we need them to move this needle too. And so in terms of who's doing good things, I mean, the psychedelics, I'm just going to talk about stuff that I've done. So I'm doing great things, and I'm just going to be honest about it. The Psychedelic Association of Canada is doing amazing things, and I was a part of that group, and I still support them, and they're doing incredible stuff. And I think I saw Jay on here, the new executive director there. He's an amazing guy, and he's taking the torch with everything that was created there with that founding board. And they're probably, talk about community, probably one of the biggest. I mean, when I left, we were almost at 1,000 people, all donation based, all just giving. So if you can support a nonprofit and the media and the story that they're creating, I highly suggest checking out what they're doing. And yeah, if I've got the spotlight, I might as well talk about what I'm doing. And the psychedelic storytelling project for us it's going to be a big one. We're launching at Horizons in New York City in October. So we're building a platform, much like a Netflix or a TED Talk actually has been our main muse. Really to be able to go in and search for people that have had these experiences and their stories around their transformation. So instead of like TED Talks going and seeing, content around climate change or politics, you'll come in and you'll see stuff from veterans and PTSD and MDMA, or medical assistance in dying and end of life anxiety and psilocybin. And again, I'm just leaning hard into storytelling, but that I think is the extra element, because people don't make decisions based on data, they make decisions based on emotion, and the best way to do that is through storytelling. And so sorry if I didn't plug anyone that needs a plug here. I think there's a lot of amazing stuff happening, including you guys, Marigold. I think everything you've done again too, like Mike, stepping outside of making money on it. You've stepped up and you've done things from volunteering to help support the CPA with getting press releases out, and everything you've been doing behind the scenes. I'm really excited to see what we can all do together. And I'll just kind of end with that.
Thanks, Corey.
Katie,
Appreciate
can I just I just quickly want to add to that. Huge, and I think we all agree here, Therasil and what Bruce Tobin's done with Therasil has really taken industry to a whole different level. The work they did with those 4 palliative Canadians, I believe 2 are no longer with us, but they put it on the map for me. That's what I first learned. So big props to Therasil for really helping to get that message out there and driving that home in the media. And our good friend David Harder, I don't know if he's still hanging around, but they're the only approved clinical trial for practitioners and sorry, for therapists. That is significant. And if you really think about it, the work that Atma's doing over there. So we could all give each other a big hug here, but maybe that's for another time.
No, I want one more hug for David because he has done a lot. The Catalyst conference, I have to say, I haven't talked to him because I've been busy. He's been busy, but if he's still here, I hope he hears this. And if not, I'll text him. But what happened with Catalyst in Kingston this year has been incredible in terms of the name of the conference is so perfect because it has catalyzed so much here already. Our university is behind us, our military is behind us, our city and our economic development is behind us now. And it's all happened, I think, in a lot of ways. I've been petitioning them for years, but the catalyst was actually the conference coming in. And now they've given us the space for free to build a center with a community of practice model. So there's all these practitioners coming together. And I have to say that a big turning point was when that conference came in. So David and Natalie and Michael, I know you're a big part of that, and Katie too, just getting that here for me and my community, small community here, it's growing crazy since then. And I think that'll be a big catalyst moving forward. So thank you, David, and everyone involved with that.
Oh, there's David. Thanks, Corey. Join us in Calgary in he means 2023. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, we're excited about that too. Kingston was amazing. Queen's University is beautiful. I didn't get to everything on our list, but I want to be kind of cognizant of time here. I thought something kind of valuable to leave our audience with is probably tips around building your personal brands. Like, we're all communicators. That comes kind of naturally to us, communicating on social and LinkedIn and doing some thought leadership stuff like today is really in our wheelhouse. But what are some of your tips for some of these people who are wearing many hats, launching some amazing startups, but also currently the ones responsible for their communication and all of their PR? Michael, you want to start with some tips and advice?
Write, podcast, whatever you have to do to tell your message in a coherent way, do it. I know when I started my venture into psychedelics 2.5 years ago, it was middle of COVID, and I was really trying to discover how I wanted to get involved. And I took my passion for having cancer 15 years ago. I took the passion of having 2 parents die of palliative diseases when I was in my teens. And I connected it with psychedelics and then took my skill set in government relations. And funny enough, I spoke with Sanjay and Ronan Levy with Field Trip, and I said, have you guys thought of this situation, how it applies to medical assistance in dying? And they said, we hadn't thought of that. Why don't we start working on that project? And it takes one project. That's all it takes to establish your reputation in the space. So find what that is, talk about it, get excited about it. Don't be afraid. I often think of Steve Jobs in his 2005 Stanford address about knowing that he was going to die was the best thing to ever happen to him, because that's when he became his most creative and innovative self. So, I impart the same knowledge. Just don't be afraid. Go out there. If you have something to say it respectfully. And I guarantee you, reaching out to people on LinkedIn in the psychedelic space is super easy because we're a loving community and we all come from different backgrounds and we love to talk and help each other out. So write about it, talk about it. And if you have an idea, don't be afraid to pitch it, because I can guarantee you 1 out of 10 times, it's all it takes to work. And you'll get into the space from there and take that to the next level. Learn from others.
Awesome. Thank you. Corey, what's your advice?
So much. I know we don't have time. I think one funny, I guess might seem direct, but it's actually very vulnerable, is stop acting like we have it all figured out. We're trying our best. We're all trying our different ways. So just be vulnerable, just be honest. That creates, humanism, and we need that more than anything right now. Be willing to be wrong. Be willing to be honest about that, act from integrity and accountability, and step up when you are wrong and be honest about it. I think collaboration is huge too. We need to support each other. Like I said before, we're all in this, good or bad, together. And Mike's been a big proponent of that and bringing a lot of different groups together to do different things. I think getting outside of the vacuum. We're all in a vacuum right now. We're in it today. It's a really small one today, and it's not a big one outside of this even. And so we need to make sure that we get out of the vacuum a little bit, and I would encourage you. I've been doing these little psychedelic town halls here in Kingston, and we've gotten an amazing support from those that are coming in, and we may actually do one at like an old folks home, to be able to talk about this stuff a little bit more, bring some of the idea of palliative care into it, and bring it into hospice centers, and just different things like that. I mean, if I think about the Pride movement, the reason that policy changed and we were able to have gay marriage was not because of any sort of real data exchange. Obviously, that's it's a different experience, but it was because of the story. People started coming out of the closet. I think there's a lot of sort of this idea of celebrities sharing their stories almost in a bad way, and I don't think of it that way. I think they need to be a little bit more transparent about the good, bad, and the ugly, and preparing and integrating and all that. But I think we need those stories, and we need to share them widely. And I think the last thing, I guess, is just be kind. Like we're all trying to figure this out together, and we're all raindrops on a windshield, and we're going to be washed off eventually. So we might as well do what we can while we're here to improve society and improve our communities and improve ourselves. And I know that's not your typical branding advice, but to me, those are the things that have helped me in my career. And I think if I'm rubbing my crystal ball, those are the things that I think will help us get to a really nice place here, hopefully soon.
Thank you. One of my pieces of advice is put yourself out there. So, I'm going to throw it to our audience. Share your social handles again, even if you already have. They're probably way at the top of the chat. Let us know where to find you. Show up for things like this. The Psychedelics Association has been doing amazing events for a while. Corey, I've been seeing your Kingston stuff pop up, which is really cool. And we know that there's more and more that's going to be sort of evolving over time. So thank you very much to our panelists. Michael and Corey, you guys are awesome. I feel like we could have chatted forever about this topic in particular. And thank you to everyone who showed up and who stayed. We had quite a few journalists and media who turned out today, which is awesome, and lots of startups and people trying to figure out how to move their business forward. So thank you very much. Brooke, I'll throw to you to wrap.
Yes, incredible insight from our panelists on the importance of PR, branding, and storytelling. So a big thank you again to Katie, Michael, and Corey for joining us today and providing insight on how to establish a presence in this rapidly expanding industry. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today for Marigold Live PR and branding in the psychedelic space. This has been an incredible, informative event. If any questions were left unanswered, like Katie mentioned, please put your LinkedIn within the chat. We'd love to connect further. Katie, if you want to give a thank you as well.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And again, just please feel free to reach out. I know all of our speakers today, you can find all of them on LinkedIn, and they're all pretty active in that regard. And like, I echo some of the sentiments earlier that this is quite an interesting community that is willing to help. And if you do have questions and you want to engage with someone you may have met today, I bet you they'd be happy to chat. So visit us at marigoldpr.com if you have any branding PR questions, and we'll chat soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.